Davey needs no introduction, obviously, and most of you remember his grandfather. So, with great anticipation, we look forward to your talk, Davey.
Thank you, John. I've been stripped of the microphone, so I hope you can hear me. Generally, I'm in trouble for speaking too loudly in any case. So I'm apologize for this, the last in front of me, but I've got too many papers. I can't talk out of my head. And apart from anything else, it hides my book a bit. So I'm going to be talking to you today about our grandfather, because Anne is here and Jenny is here, and we've got Jane as a great granddaughter. And unfortunately, Tim and Julian couldn't be here, nor Judy Dugmore. But I'm going to talk to you as I remember him. And judging from Lorette, I'll probably be corrected from the floor. We knew him as Gatty or Gats, and his father, Walter, who was up there, was known as Gapity. I'm quite nervous in talking to you about something that's quite close to us, in that it's so interwoven into the fabric of our family and of such great interest to us, and it might be thoroughly boring to some of you, so I hope not. For those watching on YouTube, you do have the fast forward function. I will follow this introduction by talking from a transcript of a recording made for, I think it was Springbok Radio, to Gatty in 1967. My mother passed this transcript on to me near her 100th birthday, nearly 2 years ago. I'm sure that quite a few of you might remember him. He was very formally known as Mr. Rubidge or Uncle Wallace, but to us, there was no formality. He was just Gatty. In the interview, mention is made of so many Graaff-Reinet families, which is what prompted me to actually share the interview with you. We live in this extraordinary community, and I believe that part of what we are is the intergenerational connection we have within our families and our friends. Consider my mother, our mother. She knew her grandparents, and she knows intimately her great-grandchildren. And if you work it out, it's a family connection that spans like 200 years, and that we live in that environment. Just some historical background. Gatty was born in 1881. Sorry, David. Said no dates. And he died in 1974. He was one of 16 children. Only 4 of these survived past the age of 12. And none of the ones that survived died before 90. They weren't Lala, which is Rosie and Les's great-grandmother, right? So it's Penny was the daughter, Penny Wise, where Manfred and Sandra live, and then Herold Wright, and then this next generation. And then there were the 2 spinster sisters, Aunt Zoe and Ovi, Rosalie and Olive, who would end up in Cypress Grove, number 27. And then, of course, our grandfather. Beebe noted that in the Anglican cemetery, the first 2 little boys, no, so they weren't boys, the first 2 little children, one brother and one sister, one of them fell ill and they came in from Rooiberg to see the doctor, and they went home with no children. Yeah. Okay, now I want the next one, that one. He married Alice Welshman, daughter of Dr. Walter Henry Welshman, who was one of the early presidents of the Graaff-Reinet Club, and he presented the Welshman Shield to our local cricket clubs, and they still compete for that today. We've never been able to establish whether he played cricket. Together they had 6 daughters. The next one. Okay, there they are. So we've got Anne's mom, Oli, Betty, Edie McNaughton, Judy Dugmore, Joni Sharp, my mother, and Carol. They raised their family on Dalham and lived in the house where Gary and Yvette live in today. Just up the road, in the big house, lived his widowed mother and 2 spinster sisters. The mathematicians would have worked out by now that he was outnumbered 10-1. He was known on occasion to walk behind the reservoir at the back of the house, take off his hat and stomp on it. He also never answered the telephone without first combing his hair. I don't remember him without a tie, nearly always a sports coat. All 6 of the daughters received tertiary education, which was quite something in those days. Of the 6 daughters, 4 ended up in Brenda Howard's Court. So it was Oli, Anne's mom, in number 5, Edie, Judy's mom, in number 10, Carol, the youngest, in number 1, and then our mother, who is also in number 1 and has been there for 22 years. I am the youngest of the 14 grandchildren and the best behaved. Anne is the eldest, the most influential and beautiful. And then we can go to Anne, this one. And you'll see what I mean. I carry, and then I think that's Wendy, Anne, is it not? Yeah. And then I carry his name, Wallace, as my second name, that I've been very proud and honored to do. There are 24 great-grandchildren, and there are 38 great-great-grandchildren. And we were just adding up now, but there are some great-great-great-grandchildren. Yeah. So, and that is Jani's grandchildren and Sandy. And I don't know if there's some other undisclosed ones. Gatty retired from farming in 1949 and moved to Elifa, which is 90 Stockenstrom Street. We can go to the next one. No, this one. We might have to come back. Oh, sorry, it's me that got it wrong. Elifa, so you all know where Elifa is. Can we just backtrack to this previous slide, because these are the cousins, and it's just Anne and Bibi that aren't here. So we've got Jolie, Judy, 2 Sharps, Jenny, Zanny, Kalilu, and Jessie. So just an interesting little side. Anne had how many? 10 bridesmaids. And I was very put out because all my sisters and cousins were bridesmaids. And Gatty consoled me and said, no, he and I would be the worst men. There were 2, back to the house one. There were 2 flat roof buildings when they bought this. And Granny Anne reminded me, was very keen on gables because she'd put gables on the Dalham small house as well. And so they put the gables on, and very little has changed since then. About 5 years ago, while we were renovating the home, we discovered that the flat roofs were still intact underneath those gables. And in order to rewire and whatnot, we removed them, the flat roofs, and these we repurposed as a goat shed. On entering the old storeroom on the property, when looking over, the smell of Stockholm tar and benzene and linseed oil and metacystox and poison, probably DDT or dieldrin, and untold others was still clearly there. And I'm sure the nostalgia of that nearly 60 years of memory tipped the balance into buying back Elifa. The Elifa plot ran from Stockenstrom Street right through to Donkin Street. It was a child's paradise. There were vineyards of every description, figs of every flavor, apricots, peaches, sugarcane for us children. There were walnuts and almonds and a huge pecanut tree which survives to this day. There was lucerne for the fowls. Every day we would walk down to collect the eggs and feed the fowls. And it fell on my lot to collect the eggs from under the broody hens. And I still thrill touching a hen today. Some of the nesting boxes had porcelain eggs in them. And I always thought that these were there in order that the fowls might know what to do. There were 4 full-time houseworkers and 2 full-time gardeners. So we lived in a different era. And in the middle of the garden was a full-size croquet court. On Tuesday afternoons, the ladies all assembled, names including Mrs. Rosgana, Mrs. Burkingwell, Mrs. Boyson, and many others. And these all had to be very correctly addressed and greeted before we were allowed to escape. I spent a lot of time with him, and I was allowed to prune the guava tree in the backyard and did a splendid job on it, he told me, but I only pruned one side of the tree. While at Union, we always had Friday lunch with them. More often than not, there was a sirloin roast, bone in, and I was given the mirch as a treat. On one occasion, entering into the conversation, I said, "Do you know what they make us eat at the hostel?" And they all inquired, no. I said, "Cow's meat." Elifa was a very happy place. On occasion of their golden wedding, all the sisters, daughters, wore dresses out of Granny's trousseau, and they all fitted. The sons-in-law were suitably attired in sportswear of the period. I know Walter and Eva were dressed as rugby players. I was sent to answer the door bell to be met by a very apologetic couple who just wanted to know what was causing so much happiness and laughter. When my grandfather upgraded my grandmother's car, he gave her old little Morris 1000 to his 2 sisters. That was to replace the Dodge that they drove, which was one of those that you changed gears. Yeah. And it had 3 gears. And they drove that little Morris for 23 years before discovering it had a 4th gear. we were very fortunate to have had him, especially considering an excerpt from the Rödeblum diary of the 24th of May 2015, which Tim very kindly shared with me. And it reads, "We went to a guinea fowl shoot this morning. Got 9 guinea fowl, 3 buck and 2 hares. Mr. Alez had the misfortune to shoot at a buck between Ted Powell and Wallace Rubidge and myself, and he hit all 3 of us. Wallace got the worst of it and had to go to the doctor, and we can only hope that it's not too serious. Ted had a narrow escape. It was a careless incident because we were quite out in the open. Then the entry on the next day, the 25th, reads, Wallace is all right, a narrow escape. Next line, Italy has declared war on Austria. I proceed now to the transcript that was done in 1967. And it was somebody very kindly typed it up. But the copy I got was so faded that I had to retype it with great difficulty. And I hope that I got it mostly right. So it reads, that the transcript does, I am the great-grandson of Captain Henry Rubidge, who retired from the Royal Navy after the Napoleonic Wars and came to South Africa in 1821. If any of you ever were to ask my mother whether the Rubidges were 1820 settlers, she will tell you very indignantly, no, they paid their own way. My grandfather, Charles Rubidge, was 2 years old when he came to South Africa with his parents, who settled on the farm Gletwin in the Grahamstown district. From there they moved to Bloemhof in 1839, which is now obviously where Anne and Walter lived all their lives, and then Julian presently. Bloemhof was part of a large block of farms, of which Wellwood was one. This was chosen by my grandfather, Charles, as part of his inheritance. So there's the connection between Robert and Bruce and us. Our grandfathers were, so we sort of third or fourth cousins. Third long, so. Included in the list of his development, I'm back to the transcript, he rode on horseback and led with him a pack horse to Dipkloof, which is now part of Denek, Judy Dugmore. There he collected a load of oranges which he took home. His children were allowed to eat the oranges, provided they saved the seed, which was sown and grown into what was to become a beautifully kept and well-known grove. That made it until 1990. When did those trees? 90s, yeah. That terrible 91, 90 drought. He married a Miss Leashing from Let's Crawl, and they had 18 children, of whom 11 grew to maturity. Mrs. Charles Rubidge, that's his granny, went to stay at Glenharry when her son Walter was born. We saw Walter right at the beginning. And Glenharry was named after Harry Southey, who also married a Let's Crawl Leashing. To return to my side of the Rubidge family, my father Walter started farming at Patricefontein, which is now part of the larger Bloemhof block. From there, he used to go on toch to sell rams for my grandfather. I believe he used to go right into the Free State, the rams being driven on foot. He used to go on horseback, and there were no cash sales. The rams were exchanged for a number of ewes, which he collected on his way back and took to Wellwood. So he bartered all the way home. From Patricefontein, my father went to Rubidge, for which he paid £1,000. There was a house on the property and a few fountains, and he developed the place considerably, and I believe it was the first fully fenced farm in the district. He did all the fencing himself, which is extraordinary. He made stone crawls for the kidding of his Angora ewes, and he farmed mainly with Angoras because the fever was too bad and there were no inoculation remedies. I assume that's blue tongue. In order to have suitable grazing for his merinos, this is Walter, he bought in the Aberdeen district the flat farms of Wallacedale, then named Osville-Ness, but renamed after me at the time of my birth, Van Exkraal and Pitfontein. At the time, Mr. Oscar Evans was farming Angoras near Johnsonville. He later moved to Melrose in Bedford. To improve his flocks with fresh blood, he imported 2 consignments of Angoras from Turkey, and these he auctioned at a sale in Johnsonville. A syndicate made up of my father, Mr. Walter Edwards, and Mr. Henry Marsdorp paid the highest price of £400 for a ram they bought on the sale. So if you extrapolate the £1,000 to £400, and then what the farm is worth to, we should be selling stock at 8 million. My father, that's Walter, also farmed ostriches for which the fencing was done, and he had cattle at Rooiberg. There were no boreholes or windmills in those days, so realizing the need for these, my father made ground dams on his farms. As a matter of interest, when my father was the Member of Parliament, he was known as Dam Rubidge. He introduced the bill for the construction of the Van Ryneveld Pass Dam and is reputed to have said, "You must dam South Africa to save it." Luckily, there are no dam Rubidges left. My early childhood was spent at Rooiberg. Our travelling in those days was done by cart and horse, and I recollect that when I was very young, I was nearly drowned once when returning home. My father hit a stone in crossing the Sundays River drift near Kendrew. The river was in flood. I was thrown from the cart and only just saved in the nick of time from being submerged. And then in a document that Jean Margaret lent me yesterday, I read there too that one of the other siblings that didn't make it, one of the many that died, fell from a cart and was killed on his way to town. So they had jolly bad luck. In 1898, Rooiberg was sold to Mr. Robert McFarlane for £10,000. So Rob there grew up on Rooiberg, so he knows the place intimately. The sale of the stock, Gardner, was the first sale conducted by Messrs. Watermeyer and Co. And later, Mr. McFarlane sold Rooiberg to Reggie Holmes, whose son Percy farmed it for some time. The McFarlanes, that there are two behind memorial plaques in St. James's behind the pulpit. Am I right, Herold? Yeah, of the two McFarlane sons that were lost their lives in the First World War. He in turn sold it to Robert Hobson, which is Robert's great-grandfather. Wallace, Van Exkraal and Pitfontein were sold at the same time to Messrs. Frank and Charles Marsdorp. An interesting recollection from the Rooiberg days was my father's cattle farming near Vryburg. He had 100 big fat oxen running there, and when the rinderpest broke out, the government, in order to stop the disease, ordered the destruction of all these cattle, and he was paid out £4 each for them. Another incident I recall while living at Rooiberg is the following. There was a murder in Grafried while work was being done on the Willow Walk furrow by a gang of convicts. So I take it that was the Mackie's pit water coming down. And these two, Gous and Sponto by name, attacked and killed the warder. They were at large in the district with his rifle and ammunition. Sponto was captured fairly soon, tried and hanged. For several years, Gous, living off the surrounding farms, went free. In those days, stock were herded, and at Rooiberg, Gous appeared with his rifle and demanded a slagboek from the shepherd. This was immediately reported to my father, who sent post-haste to all the neighbors for help to round up the criminal. Sure enough, that night, a fire appeared on the top of Busman's Kop at Rooiberg. This kop was surrounded during the night, and at daybreak, another fire appeared on the next door adjoining Eland's Kop. So he foiled his capturers. He made good his escape for several months after this, but was finally betrayed by his own brother on the farm in Aberdeen, Skitfontein, which is Henny Barnard is today. His brother came upon him in the veld, and the fugitive threatened to shoot his brother, who said, "Ach, skiet maar." Only one cartridge remained in his magazine, and this one had no powder in it because he'd been using the powder to light his fires. The criminal was tried and hanged. I was one of a group of interested schoolboys at St. Andrew's College at the time, and we made every effort to witness the execution which took place in Grahamstown. We don't know whether they actually got it right, but anyway. He started school with Mrs. Maud as his governess at Rubidge, and then from the age of 10 he went to the Graf Reinet College, which was under the principalship of Mr. Leroux. So we'll all recall that very interesting talk Johannes gave us, and a lot of this ties in with that. Some of the well-known scholars during my time were the Marsdorps, Willie, Gerard, Hubie, Ernest, Louis, and Herman. There were Poles, Retiefs, Kingwills, P.J. Slobbert, Joe Kroon, Arthur Hobson, Henry Nordee, Henry Stanford, Willie Crawford, Wally and Gilbert, and Fred Probart, Mr. Fick the Miller, Charles Goodals, Henry Foster, Willie Leroux, and Jamie and Robbie Murray, Jim, Robbie, and Archie Lookoff, Frank Murray, Emil Barman, Fritz and George Willie, and Wally Welshman. In those days, it's interesting to note, one had to go overseas for your tertiary education. And when he had matriculated en route to England, and he was in Cape Town, Mr. Henry Marsdorp, who was then the MP for Graf Reinet on the old Parliament, took my grandfather, Wally Welshman, and Herold Marsdorp to Grootskier for lunch with Cecil John Rhodes. And he says there, and it was there that we had our first glass of beer. When the Boer War was over, they went to live in Middelburg for a year or two. And it was during this time that my grandfather was negotiating to buy Grootfontein. However, the British government bought it for £15,000 in order to maintain the occupational cavalry and military force in the country. In 1903, my father bought Dalham for £10,000 from a Mr. Fuller, who had made his living there by selling wood and burning lime. The kiln was at Knoffelfontein, which I think is known as Top End today. Certainly in their time it was known as Top End. And burning lime was quite a common occurrence in the area. There's a lime kiln at Canarisfontein, at Ordonancy. There are huge lime kilns up and down the river there. And that lime was used to build the Graf Reinet Training College original building. And built entirely out of lime burnt out there. So we're back to Dalham. There was no weir at the time, only a tuck dam in the river. They farmed mainly ostriches, which were booming at the time, and our record price for £1 of feathers was £110. The most we paid for a group of stud birds, 2 cocks and 2 hens, was £500. I remember once we bought 3 cocks from Koloniesplas. These we named Arthur, Panel, and Grey. During the ostrich boom, we all went for ostriches. In fact, we had all our eggs in one basket. The birds were plucked half yearly, and we averaged £10 per bird per annum. When the First World War broke out, we had 500 ostriches. From the price I mentioned, the feathers became unsaleable. Then he recounts a story of a well-known farmer, Mr. Hockley, father of Ross. Would that have been Mimosa, I would take it, who called his staff together one day because he couldn't afford to feed them anymore. And he said that he was going to give them ostrich meat as their ration. And one of the staff members stood forward and saluted and said, "Ja, seer, ek is tevrede, solank as die afval nie na my kant toe val nie." For our part, we couldn't feed the birds, and we ended up selling them to the local population for 10 shillings apiece. We had to look for some other source of income, and we turned to pigs, but this was too soon overdone. Eventually, we fell back to small stock, and the ups and downs of farming were also very evident in this line. As an example, in 1925, we sold 84 bales of wool for £3,500. And in the depression of the early 30s, we got £1,200 for 240 bales of wool. In 1915, my father bought the farm Flockfontein in the Aberdeen district for £1,000. It was 3,000 Morgan. He later bought on Global Scale, Safer and Wynlaagte, all for less than £1 per Morgan. On my father's death, I bought an adjoining farm, Cronville for £9,000. We farmed principally Persians in the Aberdeen district, and there was a very bad drought in 1927, which he managed to bring most of them through the drought by burning woofs. So, I mean, that's something that I've done in my lifetime. And it was very interesting because you used to make a fire on a braai grid and then go from Noorspol to Noorspol, and it burnt the thorns off, and then the stock could eat it. And it was very interesting because the goats in particular, the moment they saw a rookie, then they'd come running. Anyway, he brought his Persians through, and when the rains came in 1928, it rained for a week. And out of the flock of 1,200 ewes, 800 in lamb sank belly deep into the sodden ground, and just there they died. They couldn't move. Oh. He often told that story, and it was... From then on, I farmed with merinos. My father and I had made lands at Dalham on either side of the Gots River. We built weirs, and I built a large ground dam with mules and skraapblokke. So there's the connection with Julian again and the mules. In 1949, I returned to Graafrenet after selling Dalham to Mr. Percy Holmes. So the Holmeses followed the Rubidges from Rooiberg to Dalham. It is now farmed by his son Reg, who is now Gary. He also sold all his Aberdeen farms in 1949, which was a great sadness because the wool boom was 1950. So he would have, anyway, that as a point of interest in Aberdeen, on the Aberdeen farms, to jackal-proof our fences, we had to pull in a double strand of wire at the bottom because there were not enough stones to pack them. He goes on to say, I wouldn't have missed any part of my life. I enjoyed the past as much as the present. I wouldn't like to go back to those days knowing what I know today. One must take the rough with the smooth. We managed just as well without fridges, no cars, no electricity. At Rooiberg we had no separators. Our milk was separated with two big open skottels and ladles. My mother made her own soap and candles. The only medicine we knew was castor oil. Knowing no better, we were quite happy. As for entertainment, we had our amateur theatricals, which we enjoyed as much as we do the wonderful shows that are on now. When there was a dance on the neighboring farm, we would ride there on horseback, dance all night, ride home, arrive at daybreak, change into our khaki clothes, and go back to work. So in spite of the lack of comfort and speed, we enjoyed our shows every bit as much as the modern generation enjoy their far more elaborate forms of entertainment. A story connected to the early transport which is worth telling is that after the death of his grandfather at Wellwood, his grandmother settled in the townhouse known now as the Residency. Melly, where's the regs? Can you help where that would have been? Anyway. Yeah. Anyway, so she retired to the Residency. My uncle Henry Rubidge, who farmed at Patrijsfontein, used to stable his horses in the backyard when he stayed in town. And the horses were watered daily at the Brandtam. So Brandtam, I assume, is for the fire. It was the source of water for the fire engines. But this used to be on the site of Mr. Mankis' present barbershop. And I think that's where Bruce's building is. No, that's where the barbershop was. The groom, having taken his horses to water, was in the habit of riding one horse bareback, leading the other. He'd race these horses down the street and into the stable. And one morning, Uncle Henry closed the Poort gate while the groom was at the Bront Dam. The groom, as usual, came careering down the street, turned his horses into the Poort, and naturally came to a very abrupt halt. The groom continued on a mountless ride over the gate into the Poort, landed on his feet, and said, "En so ry ek." He recounts that the veld throughout the district was covered with much more big bush and spekboom. This latter, in particular, has become very denuded from when I can first remember them. When I used to ride on horseback from Dalham to Graafrenet, I used to ride in cattle footpaths on account of the very dense coverage of Rivergana in what today is known as the Dam Camp. I hope that I've been able to do justice to him. In Judy Dugmore's words, that beloved, modest, family-adoring old gentleman, who was indeed a legend in the most unassuming way. Thank you.